Hi, my name is Sam. I now want to kind of talk about democracy and some of the main principles about democracy. So, there's no other line that could explain democracy better than, of course, the famous quote by President Abraham Lincoln, which states that government of the people, by the people, for the people. Basically, the theme of this quote is referring to that a government that is revolving around the people, where the people are the main input to a government as well as the output to a government. And the major power of the government should be by the people, and that's why most of the time democracy is referred as the people's government. One thing that is important to understand is that democracy is not an efficient system. It was not designed for efficiency, but rather it was designed for accountability and transparency. So for example, in a dictatorship country, if the dictator wanted to create a law, all he had to do is to just tell his subordinate to do it. Whereas in a democratic country, if the government wanted to create a law, so for example, U.S., the law would have to be passed on to the Senate, the House, and the media to be debated to see if the law was in the best interest of the people. So that would be the transparency part. If the law was passed and it was not in the best interest of the people, then the people who voted for the law will be accounted for. So that will be the accountability part. So definitely, democracy is not an efficient system. But most importantly though, a political system should not be designed just for efficiency. It should be designed for sustainability. So that's why democracy is a complex system that is not very efficient, but it is much more sustainable than other types of political system. And this is the inefficiency is usually the main criticism of democracy. But of course, sustainability is the most important. Now, democracy is not a static system. It is a system that changes with time. And because democracy has a lot of flaws in it, that's why it changes. So the system itself is organic. It's always moving and changing with time. So some of the problems about democracy should actually be addressed and then look at, so that the system itself could be fixed in the future. Now, this is the most important part in my opinion. Democracy has a lot of different components. It's not just about voting for your own leader. That's only one part about democracy. And democracy has all these different components that it requires all these components to work together in order to have a successful political system known as democracy. If even just one of the component is taken out of that democracy country, then the whole system will just collapse and not work. And that is one of the reasons why democracy does not work in certain countries, because some of the components, which I will explain in the next couple of slides, don't exist at all. Now I'll talk about the first component, which is similar. It's the concept of constitutionalism. Basically, in a democratic country, all the laws that are being made has to be within a parameter, a barrier of making laws. So what is this barrier? This barrier could be limiting the amount of power the government has, or the basic human rights. So what that means is you cannot create laws that gives too much power to the government or take away someone's human right. And most importantly is that this framework has to be very difficult to change. Otherwise, the whole system would just collapse. But it should be hard to change, but not impossible to change. But it has to be from the majority of the people. This circle I will use the next few slides to represent the parameter of making laws. So the most important component of democracy, of course, is the ability to vote for your own leader. But you need to have several components in order for this to work. The first, everyone needs to have full access to the ballot so that they can vote for their leader. Secondly, everybody needs to have protection from influence to vote for a specific party. Lastly, you need to have fair counting. The number of ballots voting for a specific leader should actually reflect what the population wants. So these are the simple basic components about democratic election. Now, this concept of having a federalism, state and local government is also part of the democracy. And the consensus of this is that power should be distributed evenly towards different levels of government. So why is that important? Because the founding father understands this one logic, is that if the government is farther away from the people, then it's much harder to create laws to rule them, and the citizen that they're ruling under would have a harder time to trust the government. So that's why it's important to have local, state, and government, so that the local government will have a better understanding of their own regions, so that they can make laws that are better fit for them. And last but not least, decentralization of the government is also acting as a defense mechanism for conqueror. So in a decentralized government, it's much harder to conquer because you have all these different levels of government. Whereas a dictatorship, all you have to do is take over one government. What is the most important thing to get out of this is that this type of governance is very useful in countries that has a very diverse culture and the population is quite large. Because of the diverse culture from each region, they would require specific law to guide their specific region. So this component of the democracy is really well established for a country like, for example, US, which is a nation of immigrants. The next component is the creation of laws. In a democratic country, the lawmaker will make laws to serve the citizen. But most importantly, the citizen will have to give input to the lawmaker by either voting for a specific leader that will draft a law on their behalf, or protest against a law that is not in their best interest. So in a democratic country, this must occur. In a democratic country, there must be an independent judiciary. So why is that important? So for example, once again, I'm using this diagram to talk about the parameters of making laws. So if a lawmaker is creating a law and it is breaching the framework of the law, so basic human rights and limited power to the government, then there must be a gatekeeper to look at all these laws to see if they go through the parameter, the framework. And this is especially important because sometimes majority of the people might create laws that limit the power of the minority or take away their human rights. But because of the gatekeeper being there, even if there's a majority of the people that are making laws to give more power to the government, there's always a gatekeeper to veto that. And which I will talk about later, about protecting minorities. In a democratic country, the president should be given enough power to rule the country, but not too much power to become a dictator. And the president should always be relying on using his or her political skills in convincing the people and the different branches of government to establish a specific goal. And what is most important, of course, is again the framework of making laws that will prevent the president to be the master of the people and instead be the servant of the people. The next is the role of a free media. In a democratic country, people are generally not, they don't really have a lot of time to understand about the government. They're not going to spend all their time to go into a government building and then see how they're doing. That's just very difficult. So what happens is that there's a media that tells them what the government is doing so that they can react accordingly by voting or protesting the government. And usually a dictatorship government will limit the media coverage so that the people would not go against the government. But of course, there's also some flaws about the U.S. system where the media is controlled by interest groups. But I will talk about that the next time. So another key role about the roles of an interest group is that as an individual, you're not strong enough to influence the government to do a specific thing. But as a group, you're much stronger. So for example, if you care about the environment, then you would join an environmental group to protest against the government and give them political pressures to make laws that are better for the environment. Of course, there's also some flaws about this. Is if your specific interest group has more money, then of course you will have a bigger force and more political pressure. This part is protecting the minority rights. Basically, in a democratic country, you can't make laws by the majority, and that will limit the human rights of the minority. Otherwise, this country will not be democratic. So no matter what, the majority cannot convince the government to limit the human rights to the minority. And I think a good example would be back in the days in World War II in Germany, where most of the people in Germany, they were convinced that that the Jewish people were not good for their own society. That's why they supported the government to give the Jewish people they were not treated well, and they went to the prison camp. So this is one of the reasons why. And most importantly, this is protected under the framework of the lawmaking. Last but not least, this component, which I think is the most important, is the civilian control of the military. So basically, in a democratic country, the civilian authority should always have ultimate power to the military. Because back in the days, a leader was known as someone that could conquer and protect a nation. But what happens a lot of times is that a general becomes so popular that they will overthrow the civilian government, which will create political instability, of course. So what a democratic country is all about is having a civilian control the military, not generals. Generals are only advisors. The ultimate control of the military should be civilian authorities. And this concept is much easier to apply nowadays because majority of the personnel that are in the military, during their off-duty seasons, they return to become back to civilians. So that's the reason why it's important to have a civilian authority to control the military. So that is for now. So these are some of the basic components about democracy. I hope you guys learned a lot today. Thank you for watching.